Hey there everybody, it's Mike DiLisio with another solo mode review. Today I'm going to be taking a look at Raiders of Scythia from designer Shem Phillips and publisher Garphill Games. This is a game that is built off of the same system as Raiders of the North Sea, a worker placement game, with a couple of elements added from the expansions and some new twists and a slightly different theme. We're going to head over the table in a moment. I'm going to give you a little bit more of a rules overview than I typically do, although it still won't be an exhaustive rules overview. The full video talking about the multiplayer game will go into a bit more detail, but I'm going to give you a little bit more context for some of the solo actions than I might normally, and then we'll come back here and I'll give you my final thoughts on the game. So let's head over to the table and take a look at Raiders of Scythia. Okay, here we see an example setup for the solo game of Raiders of Scythia, and this is essentially the setup for a two-player game, which makes sense because you are going to be playing against a single AI opponent in the solo game. As far as component differences, there are very few. All of the solo components that you need to play the game are right here. You've got your deck of scheme cards. These are the AI cards that are going to show what your opponent, is going to do on their turn. I'll show you how those work in a moment. But during setup, what you're going to do is you're going to choose the level of difficulty that you want to play against. And that is all dependent upon the hero card that the AI is going to take. And so from easiest to more difficult or most difficult, I'll show you these. So the trader is the easiest. He starts with a strength of 0 and 1 provision. Then you've got the lookout. The lookout, she's got a strength of 1 and 2 provisions there. Then you've got the huntsman with 1 strength, 2 provisions, and a special ability at the bottom, which says that whenever they would normally gain 2 provisions, instead they're going to gain 3. And then the most difficult would be the outrider. And she's got 2 strength and 3 provisions and that same special ability where instead of claiming 2 provisions, they would claim 3. So for setup, all you have to do is choose what difficulty. So let's say I chose the kind of second level difficulty. I'm going to be playing against the lookout this game. I place that there. I give them their starting provisions. I can just put those over here like in a little area for them because really all the AI is going to accumulate during the game are going to be provisions and horses. Those are the two kind of things that you might keep in their little area. All right. And then this is the scheme deck. Now my setup as a player is exactly the same as it would be normally. I start with my 3 silver, my blue worker, and my 1 provision. And at the beginning of the game, you would have what's essentially a little bit of a draft. You would have randomly 2 hero cards and 2 crew cards, and you would choose 1 pair. So you would decide what you're going to start with. In this case, I just randomly would say I have Patak as my hero, who has a ability at the town center of gaining an eagle. And I've got the Tyrant as the first member of my crew. And I place those in corresponding areas of my player area here. Okay, and then I'd be good to go. So rules changes are also quite simple. There's not a whole lot you need to account for on the AI's turn. And on your turn, you play exactly as you normally would. And so while I'm not going to go into a heavy rules overview, I am going to give you just a little bit of an overview for context. And so Raiders of Scythia is a worker placement game. It is based off of the Raiders of the North Sea system. So if you've played that, this will be very familiar to you. If you've not played that, then kind of the big hook to the worker placement here is that you're going to every turn place a worker and take a worker from a different area on the board and do 2 corresponding actions, essentially. All right. You can see the board is broken down into regions. You've got 5 different regions. You've got Greece, Persia, Assyria, Samaria, and then a village area up there. And that is going to be because you're doing work actions up here in the very top. That's going to be where you're gathering provisions and money that you can use to hire crew members that you're recruiting at the meeting tent, taking actions for your hero cards, gaining potentially eventually horses and eagles to add to your kind of crew here so that you can go out into these other areas and raid. And so essentially on your turn, you're going to be working or raiding. Early on in the game, essentially you're going to be going to the working areas up here. And for particular spots, you're going to get different rewards depending on the type of worker. There's 3 different colors of workers. There's a blue worker that you start with. There's gray workers and red workers. You don't start with a gray or red worker, which means that 2 of the spots up here, the stables and the chief's tent, are not available to you at the beginning of the game. You'll get those workers through raiding. You can see the gray and red workers down here. So let's just say, to give you a brief example, I went to the silversmith here. A blue worker gives you 3 coins. A gray or red worker would give you 2. So in this case, a blue worker is better. I gain those 3 coins, add them to my personal supply there, and then I have to pull a worker from a separate area and do a corresponding action. One thing I kind of messed myself up with here is I would have started with 3 crew cards in hand. You start with 5, discard down to 3. So let's just say I had these 3 in my hand. All right. They're not in my actual crew yet. They're just ready to be hired by going to the barracks. So let's say instead I went to the town center, pulled this worker and did that action, which is either playing one of the cards in hand for the right side ability, gain 2 kumis and 1 provision. So if I wanted to, I could just discard this card instead of hiring it later to do that. Or I could do one of the other actions, or I could do my hero action, which is gaining an eagle. So let's say I did that. I did my hero action. I chose one of these 3 eagles and I placed it above one of these spots. It doesn't have to go above an active crew member, but oftentimes you will want to do that, and then you would replace that. So that's my turn. I placed a worker, did an action, pulled a different worker, and did a corresponding action. Now, the AI is going to do a very simple thing, which is this is the scheme deck, which is shuffled at the beginning of the game, and you simply flip over the card and go through a series of operations. And so here's how it works. You're going to look along the left side of the card, and you're going to kind of go step by step and see where can they not do the corresponding action. So first it asks, okay, are there any spots left in Samaria to raid? Well, Samaria's here, no spots have been raided, so we know that that is still fine. So Samaria still has spots to raid, so we don't do that corresponding action, which would have been to claim a quest tile. So, next, can they spend 2 provisions? Well, absolutely, they can spend 2 provisions because they started the game with 2 provisions, because we chose the lookout. If they could not have spent those, let's say they had 0 or 1 provision, then they would gain 2 provisions. Okay? But they have them, so it's fine. Next, do they have 1 strength? I'm going to make sure we're getting this in focus. Do they have 1 strength? They do have 1 strength. The lookout started with 1 strength. If they didn't get 1 strength, they would instead take the middle horse off of this row, which would give them an extra 3 strength on their next turn. So they would have 4 strength. But they've got the 1 strength, so they're good to go there. And so what this is saying is all of these 3 things can be fulfilled. Samaria has spots to raid. They have 2 provisions. They have 1 strength. So therefore, what they're going to do is gain 4 victory points and raid that 3rd spot in Samaria. If that spot had already been raided, they would just move to the right and cycle left if they had to do that. So on the AI's first turn, they're going to raid, which is good for them, bad for me. So you spend those 2 provisions. You take that corresponding spot in Samaria, which is right here. These just go back to the supply. This quest tile gets flipped over, and you give 4 points to the AI. All right, so they've already got a 4-point lead on me. And the other thing this card does is it blocks a spot for me on my next turn. Now, I cannot go to the meeting tent. I can't place there. If there is a worker there, I can't remove from there. All right, that's simply how it works. I could take another turn. I just couldn't go to the meeting tent. You're going to go back and forth, taking your turns, AI taking their turns. The AI is going to be gaining provisions throughout the game. They're going to be gaining horses. Now, when they gain horses that give them strength, they're going to spend those horses when they need to. So if they needed 3 strength, for example, and now they had this, which would give them 4 strength, they would have to actually discard that horse to use it, so that they have to rebuild up that strength. It's not something that they keep throughout the game. They have to spend it when they need to. when you as a player are going on these raids, you are having to assess your crew members, the strength of your crew members, the number of your crew members. So for here, it's saying you need to have at least 3 crew members, you need to have 4 provisions, and you need to have a blue or a gray worker. So if you fulfilled those conditions, you would go to this spot. I don't have those conditions now, but let's say I did. You would go there and you're going to roll dice. And here it's going to tell you the type of dice you roll. I'm going to be rolling a red and a white just off of a base of going to Assyria. And then you have to look at the number of spaces that have gold on there. In this case, both spaces in this area have gold. So I'm rolling an extra 2 yellow dice, which isn't great because yellow dice don't give you strength. All they do is potentially add wounds. So let's say to make this realistic, I would need at least 3 crew members. Let's say I had 3 crew members. Oops. I had 3 crew members. I spent my 4 provisions, and I'm assessing my strength here. Right now, I've got 8, 9, 10, 11. I've got 11 strength. What this is telling me is that anywhere from below 10 strength and above 2, you're just going to gain 2 wounds, and you'll also gain the plunder. But I'm already above that 10, so I'm good. What I'm hoping for is to get over 16 so I can get 4 points. So I started with 11. I'm going to roll these dice, add any values to it. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. I just missed that 16. So I would gain 2 points in this case, but I'm also going to gain 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 wounds, which is not great. 2, 4, 6, and 7 wounds that I now have to place among my crew members. So let's say I put 2 here, 2 here, and 3 here. Now, this means that these crew members are weakened, and if they were to go back out on a raid without getting healed, they're going to have to subtract the number of wound tokens they have to their strength. So instead of 4, this crew member would now only have 2 strength. Instead of 3, they'd have 1. So it's something that you need to account for, because when you're going out on these raids, your crew members are oftentimes going to get wounded. So let's say I had done this. I choose one of these 2 spots. Maybe I would take this. I would take the plunder. I would flip over this quest tile, and now I would get that gray worker that I could then use on a future turn. That would be how I can get to the chief's tent or the stables and later come to these areas down here that need gray or red workers. And so that's how the flow of the game is going to go. You take your turn, the AI takes their turn. It's a win-loss condition. If you've got more points than the AI at the end of the game, you win. If not, they win. They're going to get endgame scoring primarily based on if they have any horses at the end of the game that have points, if they didn't have to spend them, like in this case, this horse grants 2 victory points at the end of the game. If this was still in the AI's tableau, you'd be able to give them those points. And they're also going to be gaining a bunch of these quest tokens throughout the game through their AI cards, and they'll be accumulating these, and they'll get these points at the end of the game too. You'd see here 3, 5, 5, 4. Okay, so that could potentially be a large amount of endgame points that the AI gets. You're also, of course, trying to get those quest tokens as well. All right, so that's a pretty basic overview of how the solo game plays. Let's go back and take a look at my final thoughts. Okay, hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of how the solo game of Raiders of Scythia is played. As I stated at the beginning, I didn't go into a full rules overview. I talked a little bit more than I maybe would in a regular solo video, but I didn't cover things like the kumis, which allow you to add strength to raids, which is similar in some ways to a mechanic need in one of the expansions. But you get a pretty good idea of how the solo AI plays, and that's the main focus of this video. So there's a few kind of guidelines that I like to talk about when I review solo games, and one of those is win conditions. What type of a win condition is in this game? Is it a beat your high score variant? Is it a AI opponent with a win-loss condition, etc.? So Raiders of Scythia follows on from the Raiders of the North Sea solo AI, and it's similar to the AIs that you'd see in other Shem Phillips designed or co-designed games, things like Architects of the West Kingdom or Paladins of the West Kingdom, which is what they call scheme cards, which is basically similar to an Automa deck. Okay, so this has a clear win-loss condition. You are playing against an AI opponent, and depending on which opponent you choose, that's going to give you the level of difficulty. They may start with more provisions, they may start with more strength, they may even have a special ability that allows them to gain more provisions than they might normally, which means that they will more easily be able to raid, and you have to account for that in your playstyle. So it's a clear win-loss. It's the kind that I prefer, especially in a game like this where, it's a competitive game. You are really feeling that push. You're feeling that pressure. You're feeling the anxiety of, if I am not efficient, if I am not taking care of getting myself prepared, getting myself fully outfitted with the right type of crew that's going to reward me for going to particular raid spots, for example, or allow me to mitigate some of these wounds that I'm going to inevitably take when I go out on raids. You feel this pressure because that AI deck, your opponent, is relentless. They're going to be doing something, whether it is gearing up for a war, gearing up for a raid, or going on a raid, or snatching those potentially high point value quests from underneath you. And so a clear win-loss condition, something that I generally prefer. Setup and teardown is another thing that I like to talk about. And there is a fair amount of setup in Raiders of Scythia. There's no two ways about it. You have to seed the board randomly with different plunder, and you have to put out the quests in a randomized order, and you have to get the workers out and set up the card decks. So this isn't a 5-minute setup game. I mean, I think you can get it to close to that after you've set it up a number of times. It doesn't take me a whole lot more than that. But when you're first getting started, kind of making sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be, just know that you're going to take a little bit of time to set it up. It's going to take a little bit of time to tear it down. However, that being said, the experience that you're getting from that setup and teardown time is a very robust experience. And so I never feel like I'm spending too much time, that I'm not getting the type of experience that I would expect from a game that's taking a little while to set up. So I have no issues at all with the setup and teardown for Raiders of Scythia because the game experience is so robust. I definitely feel like I have played a full-scale, medium-weight game with Euro stylings, and so I don't mind a little bit of setup. That's pretty much par for the course when it comes to a game like this. Rules. Rules can be really, really tricky in solo games. Sometimes they're not as clear as in the multiplayer game. A lot of times I find that the solo rules are not fully fleshed out. There oftentimes are not given the type of examples that you find in the multiplayer part of the rule book. Even in rule books that have great multiplayer rules, where plenty of examples, illustrated examples, and everything is very, very clear, you get to the solo rules and it feels like they just kind of gave up or put them in at the last second. That is absolutely not the case with the Raiders of Scythia rules. They are clear. There are examples for every major concept that is different for the solo game, and I found little to no ambiguities in the solo rules for Raiders of Scythia. So a big thumbs up there. It had a dedicated spot at the end of the rule book, and I had no complaints at all for the rules for Raiders of Scythia. So my overall solo experience. Now, I need to preface this because I think that it is important context for this particular review. Raiders of the North Sea is it is my top rated solo game of all time. That's Raiders with the expansions. Okay, so I'm somewhat predisposed to like this game because it's built so much on Raiders with elements of the expansions brought in, although not all of them. And so it's not a surprise that, kind of putting a little bit of it out there right at the top end, that I think it's a fantastic solo game. Raiders of Scythia is outstanding. It has everything that I'm looking for in a solo game of this type. It has the tension. It has a great ratio of the amount of things that the AI is able to do with a very small amount of rules overhead and a very small amount of administration that I as a player need to do. I'm not spending more time on the AI's turn than I am on my own. And that is something that is hard to pull off, I'm finding, in games that are interactive like this. Oftentimes in interactive games, the AI deck is such that you have to really come up with a lot of side cases and priorities and this and that. The way that the AI deck, or the scheme deck as the designer calls it, is implemented in this game is brilliant. It is very, very easy. It's very procedural. Go down the left side of that list. You know, generally speaking, what you have to do at any given point. The AI turns are lightning quick, and you can spend most of the time playing the game on your turn, which is the way it should be. But you still feel that tension. You still feel that pit in your stomach when you flip over the top card of that scheme deck, because you just know that something's going to happen that's going to get in your way, that's going to block a spot you want. They're going to raid a spot that has a whole lot of provisions on there that you'd like to get to first. So it's that great balance of, I know that they're going to do something that's really going to affect me, that I'm going to have to account for, but I don't have to spend 10 minutes figuring out how their turn's going to go. So really, really well done with that. The flow of the game is also fantastic. It's fast. It's snappy. You are really able to kind of pick what you want to do and go with it. And for a base game, this is really what it comes down to. Because I know a logical question and a reasonable question to ask is, if I already have Raiders of the North Sea, do I need this? Or vice versa. If I decide to get Raiders of Scythia, should I get Raiders of the North Sea? For just the base game, I feel like Raiders of Scythia really replaces Raiders of the North Sea as just the base game, because it has all of the elements that I love of base Raiders. It brings in some elements of the expansions that I love, which basically you're talking about the dice to get wounds, adding to strength, having to deal with those wounds on your crew members. I think that's great. The Kumis are similar to the Mead in that they add strength to your crew when you go out on raids, and that means that you can have more large strength raids, and there's really much more of a sense of peril. You know, when you go out on a raid, you should feel this potential peril that, hey, not only might I not succeed, which in this case you're going to generally succeed, but I'm going to take some real heavy damage to my crew, and I may lose some of my crew. So I really like that. So for just the base game, this I think is better than base Raiders. I love the addition of the eagles and the horses. That's not something that is in any even of the expansions of Raiders of the North Sea. That's something that's new to this. Also, the solo deck. While I think the solo scheme deck in base Raiders is wonderful, this is even better. This is probably the best AI system that Garphill has come out with yet. Paladins is up there too, but this is such a simple to administer AI deck that I have no complaints. I have no, I kind of wish they had done this. I kind of wish they had done that. It's everything I'm looking for in an AI system and super fast to administer. So all of that being said, I think base game, I would go with Raiders of Scythia over Raiders of the North Sea. Now, that doesn't mean I'm getting rid of my Raiders of the North Sea, and primarily that's because when I play solo Raiders, I always add in both expansions, and that is a huge gaming experience. It's a bigger time investment, it's a bigger table investment, but the payoff is so great. That's my number one solo experience of all time, is Raiders with both expansions. This doesn't quite reach that, but that's because it's just the base game. It's also so much more quick. It's over more quickly, but you still feel like you've had this great experience. So for a base game, Scythia would be my choice. If I'm going to add all the expansions, I'm going to stick with Raiders of the North Sea. But that being said, for this game, fantastic solo system, really well done on all counts. It is what I would call an outstanding game. And for that reason, I'm going to give Raiders of Scythia a 9 and my seal of excellence. So if it sounds interesting to you, if you've got Raiders of the North Sea without the expansion and you're thinking of maybe changing it up, take a look at it. If you don't have it, you absolutely should give it a shot, because I think it is just fantastic as a solo game. Thank you so much for your time as always, and have a great day.